Hello to everyone. This is MUL 135, lecture number 2. The title of this episode is Broken Promises, Dashed Hopes. Medyo may hugot yun, pero wag na nating pag-usapan yun. This is really chapter 1 of the book, but this is reading 2, the historical context of Europe at the turn of the century. And this lecture is scheduled in your syllabi for September 16. So the book begins the chapter by saying that Europe entered the 20th century full of bright hopes. It was an era of optimism and euphoria. Euphoria, how do you explain what euphoria is? The closest experience that I can share with you of euphoria was the time when the Marcos dictatorship collapsed because of the people power. Everybody was celebrating in the streets, and the differences among Filipinos between the poor and the rich, the classes, they all disappeared. And seemingly for a moment in time, everybody was united and was very hopeful that only good things could come. So the same way Europe entered the 20th century full of euphoria with bright hopes. And this was brought about by several things. One, they were experiencing peace for more than 30 years. The last war happened in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War. Franco, of course, refers to France. And Prussia is the old kingdom that include parts of Germany, Austria, and was it Netherlands? Hungary, I think. So that was the war that ended in 1871, and for a long time there was peace. And if there's peace, there's room for growth. There could only be progress if there is peace. So there was unprecedented growth in many aspects, in all aspects of life. For one, there was improved existence, quality of life. People were much healthier. There were new vaccines being created. There was more understanding of public health. And all of this was brought about by scientific and technical developments. So in everyday living became more comfortable, became highly improved because of all of these things that we take for granted now. For instance, indoor plumbing. Nung panahon na yon, they could hardly take a bath. No? Yung mayayaman lang ang merong indoor plumbing, mayayaman lang ang merong toilets sa bahay. No? So if you watch all these movies about the Victorian era, how fashionable people seem to be, ang totoo nun, siguro, ang babaho nila kasi hindi sila naliligo. And in fact, if you read some historical accounts, the streets were littered with human feces. Doon nila tinatapon kasi wala silang toilets and plumbing as we know it now. Kaya dumami yung sakit, no? Kaya nagkaroon ng mga plague. Well, tayo rin naman meron ngayon. So, scientific and technical development help put an end to all of these. Okay, so there was expansion and prosperity. Remember, Europe is the #1 colonizer during this time. In fact, pinaghati-hati nila ang buong mundo. This part belonged to Spain and Portugal. This other half belonged to Germany, and this belonged to England, and so on. Okay, and all of these colonies, of course, produced wealth for the colonizer, for the empire, and there was economic boom, and they enjoyed all of that. Okay. Industrialization continued to rise. No? Naging mechanized production. Okay, so because of that, they were able to produce more at a lesser cost. Okay? And of course, transportation and communication continued to progress. You would now have the steamships and the trains would soon be developed. If before it took months to cross um, the Pacific or to travel from Europe to say a colony in the Pacific Islands, it took months. Ngayon, weeks na lang. So that's a big improvement, meaning mas madali sila makakapag-transport ng goods. And healthcare, like I mentioned earlier, and public services advanced because of all of these new discoveries and developments. And of course, population in the continent continued to increase. During that time, population dwindled because of wars, number one, and then because of all of the plagues and the diseases. Um, and during that time, the rise in population only meant good. You have more workers, um, you have more soldiers for the armies, and so on. So, because of good health and peacetime, the population was increasing dramatically. This is the Paris Exposition of 1900s. You have several of these, but the Paris Exposition of 1900s is famous because that was the event where the Eiffel Tower was uh, produced for. No? You would also read about the Paris exhibition. And, expositions like this is for empires like France and England to exhibit their wealth. And part of the wealth are those coming from their colonies. So they would exhibit yung mga products and even people from their colonies and culture. So we will come to read about how, for example, Debussy would hear the gamelan for the first time in one of these expositions, and he would be so enamored by it, and that sound would remain in his head, and he would try to replicate that in his pieces. We'll talk about that when we talk about Debussy. So science became the foundation of the age. They wouldn't have progress if science did not progress. Okay? So, talking about technology and communication, the telephone um, came out during that time. The electric light, moving pictures, x-rays. Pag nakita niyo yung mga accounts ng exposition, meron din sila mga moving sidewalks. So, siguro parang yung nakikita natin ngayon sa mga airport. Okay? And then you have the engineering feats, seemingly impossible, like the Suez Canal. Suez Canal, of course, is very important because it cut across Egypt. So now you can travel from the Mediterranean straight out to the Red Sea, whereas before you had to turn, coming from Europe, you have to go down south of Africa just to go to Asia. Ngayon, you can cut through Suez Canal naman. So that seemed to be impossible. That's an amazing feat, but that contributed to progress, economic progress. So as if mankind was finally in a position to solve all its material and social problems because of science and technology. Okay? Part of the development of science, or a great deal of the development of science, was hinged in the development of the theory of evolution, which was established in 1859, of course, by Charles Darwin. And it became the controlling scientific idea for many of these developments. We would not have developed any of these vaccines if we did not understand evolution. Sad to say, a lot of people are still in denial that evolution is real, right? COVID-19, for example, continues to evolve. So there's your proof. The theory offered an explanation of the plant and animal species governed by natural selection, leading to the improvement of each creature. Okay? And this is Charles Darwin. His idea soon would be adopted by many of his followers, okay, not only for science, but economists uh, and political scientists would adapt that idea that everything, just like species, are improving, okay? And all those that cannot improve would have to fall away. Okay? But all aspects of human life are geared towards improvement. So, in this view, the world is a complex organism steadily moving towards its own perfection. So, you would have political scientists, for example, um, plotting out mga graphs ng how states or government systems would develop from system to system to system. This is the original uh, book of Darwin, the origin of the species. Okay? And you know, of course, that he went to the Galapagos to study all of this. His main subject matter was the finches, and he was curious as to why in the island you have a diversity of finches when they're all the same type of bird. So progress became the watchword of the period. So the book, in fact, has an article there of Stefan Zweig saying the gospel of progress. That became uh, the byword of the era. So that feeling of euphoria and bright hopes continued on until 1941, when suddenly, unexpectedly, World War One broke out, and it started simply because he had this political figure assassinated, and then alliances were built, and pretty soon you have a world war. Of course, the world here, when we say world, only refers to Europe. We did not really experience World War One here in the Philippines during that time. But it, of course, it quickly put an end to optimisms, and the effects were devastating um, because people suddenly realized that the technology and the science that you use to improve life, um, to invent medicines and vaccines and all of that, can also be used to kill, to create machines that destroy life and destroy structures and cities. Another thing was that sometimes when you have stability and progress, there could be side effects that you don't see right away. I mean, what we mean here is um, stability and progress might be good for one sector, the upper class, but the lower class stay where they are. So that was what happened to Europe. It limited mobility and the advantage of many of these, or advancement, I should say, of many of these social classes. So pretty soon, what you will have is a lot of discontentment. Okay? Plus, you have developing new philosophy that focused on individualism and the idea of revolting against the prevailing value systems became now a rallying point for many thinkers and philosophers, among them artists as well. Ito yung mga hindi napasama sa economic development na natamasa lang, na-enjoy lang ng upper class. Science as well contributed to the breakdown of this stability. No? So nung araw, the idea was the world, the universe was mechanical. It followed certain rules. No? Ganon yung idea nila sa evolution. But then, as science progressed, you learn of new things. You learn of new realities. So, for example, the quantum mechanics developed or developed in 1900s made us understand that the world was really not as stable as it seems. It is chaotic and unpredictable. And Einstein's theory of relativity contributed to that idea. Okay, the idea that um, everything is ruled by gravity, for instance. But the bigger picture was yung dating notion nila ng stable and mechanical universe no longer is viable. Kailangan ng baguhin yung pananaw. Okay? Another theory developed was that of Freud. Okay? So before Freud, everyone thought, well, men have a spirit of humanity that makes them different from animals. What did Freud say? He emphasized that each man, each person, has an irrational side, okay, that controlled his behavior, controlled by um, sexual impulse and all of that. You know? Okay. So that's Einstein, and this is Freud. So part of all of this developments was what was happening with the artists. If you have all of these developments in the science and in um, literature and in the economy and so on, the artists will have to follow. Okay, so among artists there was also disillusionment and dissatisfaction. Okay, so parang nung turn of the century to 1914, in the First World War, the artist was saying it seems okay, but it's just a veneer. All this civilization is just a veneer. By veneer, we mean to say facade, parang artificial front, but inside you have people struggling. Okay? So artistically, between 1900 and 1914, ito ay napaka-turbulent as far as the artists are concerned. And a lot of uh, revolutionary ideas were given birth during this time. Okay? For instance, we saw during that time the end of the realist tradition. Okay? Last time we talked about the common practice period, the universal language of music, which was tonality. Okay? Ang counterpart siguro ng tonality sa visual arts is the realist tradition. No? Yung realist tradition was taken for granted, was accepted as fact since the Renaissance period. Ano ba yung realism na yun? That when you draw something, when you paint something, you try to make a picture as real as possible. Noong 19th century, biglang, hindi naman bigla, dahan-dahang na-realize ng mga artist na yung nasa panglabas, what is external is not a complete picture. That you have to look at what is happening inside, the internal psychological experiences of humans, and that became their inspiration for their creation. Okay, instead of just mirroring the external appearances and events, they went deeper to what was happening inside. Okay, so the works moved towards a state of abstraction kasi hindi mo na nga kayang i-visualize yung internal dynamics, kaya we were looking for other ways to make images of that, and so they moved towards abstraction. The final breakthrough, if you have Schoenberg writing an atonal piece in 1907, final breakthrough came just before World War I, okay, when completely non-representational drawings came out in Munich. And this is Vasily Kandinsky, the first artist that came out with drawings like that. This is an early work of Kandinsky, The Autumn in Bavaria. It's not realist in the sense, but you still see that it's representational. Right? You see images of autumn, at least the colors, probably from the Impressionist school. And that's an early work. Later on, his works would look like this: Black Spot 1, Black Violet, Composition 4, even the titles are non-representational. Okay? They're absolute. So the artist's tendency to distort objective reality, they had this tendency to distort objective reality and favored more of an internal, personalized, emotionally charged view of the world, no, in their art. So you would have realist um, pictures like this, and yet something's not right. It's distorted. So this is Kokoschka. And another movement is Cubism, which was influenced heavily by primitive art and also um, childish drawings. No? Um, the idea is turning away from Western civilization and looking at other ways of life and probably other ways of expression. So that's what Pablo Picasso did. This is Accordeonist, 1911. This is another one. So the images now, instead of ruled by um, the realism or dimension, what they call it, perspective, are now flat. Now you can see from one angle things that you're not probably supposed to see if you apply the rules of perspective. Okay, three musicians. It's Pablo Picasso. And he said, all children are artists. The problem is how to remain an artist once he grows up. In music, all areas of artistic activity, um, innovative works, attack the accepted, long accustomed assumption of a discredited past, the way non-representational art attacked the realist tradition in visual arts. Sa music naman, they started questioning all the accepted um, practices. Most of it is associated with, of course, um, the common practice period. So much of the music preceding World War One were characterized by experimentation. No? Yung first 14 years na yon, people experimented. Some of the tonal principles were retained, yeah? And a lot of them were inherited. Yeah? But what we probably should understand is that itong period na to was the last grasp, no? Or should I say gasp, of the 19th century Romanticism. Okay? Of course, like we explained last time, hindi rin naman makakarating sa point na yon, the point ng innovations and questioning all the practices kung hindi din dahil sa dumaan sila lahat sa Romanticism. This ends our lecture for today. Thank you.